Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Michael Rubin, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and Director of Policy Analysis at the Middle East Forum, about Iran's nuclear program, the growing terrorist threats from Africa, and whether the Biden administration has permanently damaged the U.S. Israel relationship. Then we dive into new information about what may have happened with the attack on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, unexpected political upheaval in Japan, and Iranian efforts to interfere in the U.S. presidential election. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. Last week we declared the quiet summer news cycle dead, and that is certainly still the case this week because we've got a lot happening all over the world. We'll talk to Michael Rubin later in the show about Iran, Africa, Afghanistan, and beyond. But before we get to all of that, as always, Guy, what's on your radar right now?
Great to be here once again, Ben. There are a few items that have caught my eye. The first is an exclusive published in recent days by the Wall Street Journal purporting to explain what actually caused the undersea pipeline explosions of Russia's Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines back in September of 2022. You'll recall these explosions were a shocking development early in the Ukraine war. It was widely seen as the kind of nail in the coffin at the time of what had once been a robust and controversial energy connection between Russia and the European Union. And of course, what or who caused the explosions has been a mystery ever since, with different governments, militaries, journalists, and intelligence analysts pushing varied speculation, some claiming U.S. intelligence was involved, some claiming it was a Russian false flag operation, some claiming it was a Ukrainian special forces op. The Wall Street Journal report is exhaustive, and it claims that it actually was a small team of Ukrainian divers using a rented yacht who went out into the Baltic Sea and planted explosives on the Nord Stream pipelines. The report claims that the plot had originally been hatched at a drunken party among Ukrainians and that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had actually initially approved, only to later call it off. But apparently the divers went ahead with the plot regardless. The journal cites anonymous Ukrainian security officials as sources. It's very interesting, and it has caused a stir in U.S. national security circles as well as European capitals. A key point here is that Zelensky's office has thus far rejected the journal story, calling it, quote, absolute nonsense, end quote, and reiterating previous allegations that it was actually Russia that was behind the bombing of its own pipelines. Remember that since Russia-EU energy ties have been severed, China has emerged as a major buyer of Russian oil and gas, and India continues to buy large amounts of Russian oil. Another point here is that the journal story came out a day after reports in Germany that German investigators believe there was a Ukrainian role in the pipeline blasts. The reports say German prosecutors have actually issued an arrest warrant for a Ukrainian man who was believed to be in Poland, where Polish prosecutors have said the man left Poland before they were able to apprehend him. We'll be following this at Threat Status to see how it all evolves. Another quick one on my radar, Ben, are indications from Japan, a key U.S. ally, that Prime Minister Fumio Kishida will not run in a key upcoming vote next month, which means the way is suddenly paved for Japan to have a new leader. Kishida has been a key player in Japan's expanding military push in recent years, shifting away from decades of post-World War II pacifism toward a more aggressive posture in the face of nearby China's expanding military prowess, threats to Taiwan, and territorial claims over disputed waterways near Japan. So we'll also be tracking how things develop in Japan.
You know, we're all still waiting, too, Guy, as we record this on Thursday afternoon to see what Iran does next with regard to Israel, if anything. There have been fears Iran could once again
Still waiting.
Still waiting, for weeks now to see if they could actually launch a direct attack against Israel in response to an operation in Tehran last month that killed Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh. That operation is widely believed to have been carried out by Israel. So far, Iran's made a lot of threats here, but hasn't actually done anything. And there's a growing belief they might forego an attack if mediators are able to reach a ceasefire deal in the Israel-Hamas war. So we'll see where that goes in the coming days, but there's plenty more to get to on Iran. There's a lot of things happening here at once. I have an exclusive report that'll be on the Washington Times website Friday as this podcast comes out about a letter to FBI Director Christopher Wray from key members of the House Homeland Security Committee asking for more information from the FBI about the investigation into Asif Merchant, who was arrested and charged last week. Merchant's a Pakistani national with ties to Iran. It's alleged that he was a cog in a failed plot to assassinate U.S. government officials, including potentially former president and presidential candidate Donald Trump.
The DOJ statement doesn't really say anything about what the actual alleged connection between this character and Iranian officials is. But it does talk about, I actually went and read the court complaint, and it talks about how he has a wife and children in Iran, but he also has a wife and children in Pakistan. As soon as I read that, I thought, is that uncommon? It seems like it probably is. But that doesn't implicate him in anything. So it's not really clear what they have on him. Obviously, it's a court case, so we're not going to necessarily hear that outright until it plays out. But I could see why U.S. lawmakers, particularly Republicans, are writing a letter saying, what the hell is this actually?
Well, I mean, look, we talked before in the show about the number of, Trump himself and number of key officials in his administration that have been targeted for assassination by Iran. Mike Pompeo, Brian Hook, John Bolton, even the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley. This, of course, is all connected to the January 2020 strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. So we're going to be monitoring that investigation and where it goes here at Threat Status for sure. And it's not the only Iranian threat right now to the U.S. We've had some wave of stories over the past week about apparent Iranian attempts to interfere in the U.S. election. This sort of burst onto the forefront last Friday and Saturday when the Trump campaign said that its internal emails were hacked by Iranian actors and that campaign documents were then apparently leaked to U.S. news outlets. They provided not much information on the details of that, but the alleged hack came just a day after Microsoft issued a public warning about Iran's efforts to meddle in our election. Our colleague Ryan Lovelace, who was just on the show with us last week, has been tracking this in detail and reported this week on new revelations from Google, which says it stopped Iran-sponsored efforts to hack into the campaigns, not just of Donald Trump, but also of Joe Biden. Now, this TAG, which is a Google unit focused on combating government-backed hackers, said it detected and disrupted a, quote, small but steady cadence, unquote, of phishing attempts from the Iranian APT-42 hacking group in an attempt to gain access to email accounts of senior campaign officials on both sides. In a lot of ways, Guy, I think this is kind of instructive, because we talk about, election meddling and election interference, sort of abstract, broad, general terms. But this is what it actually looks like in 2024 in practice. Iranian actors allegedly are trying to disrupt the effective running of presidential campaigns on both sides of the aisle. Hacking emails, leaking documents, taking other steps to basically sow chaos throughout our entire electoral system. And that doesn't even get into fears about cyber attacks on election infrastructure itself or efforts to potentially, impact the way voters see candidates, sort of where we are societally with this election. So we've got nearly 3 months until the presidential election. And, I fear we haven't seen the worst of this. I guess the question now is whether the U.S., the government and companies like Google and Microsoft, by publicly calling this stuff out in such a clear public way, might be able to thwart these Iranian efforts. And we are joined now by Michael Rubin, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the Director of Policy Analysis at the Middle East Forum. Michael, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ben.
Of course. Now, I understand you just got back from Africa, just not even 24 hours before we started recording this episode here on Thursday. So I wanted to start there because U.S. troops, of course, recently completed a pullout from Niger. When that withdrawal comes at a time of rising extremism across the Sahel and the continent more broadly. So I'm just curious, given your recent trip there and your experience, how do you characterize the extremist threat emanating from Africa right now? And is it fair to say it's a direct danger, if not to the U.S. homeland itself, to U.S. interests or allies abroad?
It's grave and growing, Ben. Look, I was in Cabo Delgado a couple years ago, which is the northern province of Mozambique, which the Islamic State took over. I just came back from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And of course, you have this vacuum, as you mentioned in your question, emanating from the Sahel, from Niger, and so forth. Here's the thing. We talk, and we all remember how bad the Islamic State was in Iraq and Syria. But when you're talking about in Congo, they have access to gold. They have access even to uranium. Congo has $24 trillion worth of commodities buried in its soil. And when you have extremist groups take over those mines, that's money that's easier to move and acquire than the oil which Iraq had. Therefore, woe to us if we drop the ball and just think, well, who really cares about Africa? Because it's really going to come back to bite us in a huge way, even greater than 10 years ago. And then when you have the Sahel with our withdrawal, which of course we withdrew because we had to, there was a coup there. The new government sort of pivoted towards the Russians. You've got a situation that when vacuums develop, it's seldom the forces of altruism which fill them. Joe Biden may brag that there is no active war ongoing, but that's wishful thinking. We are in the calm before the storm right now. And that storm, the only question is, when is it going to hit?
Well, you mentioned President Biden. I'm glad you did, because I'm just curious and this might sound like just sort of a broad, general, elementary question, but what is the solution? Because as you well know, politically, speaking of Biden or Trump, there's not a lot of appetite, it seems, among either Democrats or the Republicans right now to send an American ground troop presence to the Sahel to deal with this problem in that direct military way. So is there a solution that you see that could be implemented that's realistic right now?
Let's just not look at the Biden administration. We've had this issue ongoing with the Trump administration, Obama administration, and so forth. The fact of the matter is that we have long had a presence in these regions, and even having a small presence where we can ally ourselves and attach ourselves to indigenous forces has a force multiplying effect. I remember when President Trump had that phone call with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, and then came away from that phone call declaring that he was going to withdraw American forces from northeast Syria. The response to that in AFRICOM was, let's do whatever we can to keep the U.S. presence in Africa out of the news cycle, simply because President Trump didn't realize we had as many people in the Sahel as we did in northeast Syria. So the fact of the matter is, we've got to get out of this provincialism and recognize that if we are working with local forces, that's different than having an Iraq or Afghanistan style campaign. And if we choose not to partner with indigenous forces, it makes the need for a future Iraq or Afghanistan style campaign much more likely.
I want to turn to Iran, and I'm curious to get your take on what kinds of deliberations, calculations are going on right now in Tehran with respect to potential retaliation against Israel, which is widely believed to have been responsible for the operation in Tehran that killed the political head of Hamas a few weeks ago. As we record this on Thursday, we're still kind of all waiting to see what Iran's next move is going to be. What do you think it's going to be? And do you get the sense that Tehran is willing to go, into a full-blown war with Israel? Or do they, I've heard some folks say they prefer to operate sort of this state of near war, that when a push comes to shove, do they actually want to get into a kinetic large-scale war with Israel? Maybe not. So what do you think the calculus is right now inside Tehran, which, by the way, of course, has a new president right now as well. This is a major test for him as well.
What we're seeing right now is Iran playing the psychological, the informational component, so long as they can keep Israel guessing, that's having an economic and readiness impact on Israel itself. So in many ways, let's not underestimate Iran's sophistication. And when it comes to Iran's sophistication, there is hardly a country more sophisticated, perhaps China being the other, in gaming American election cycles, Russia perhaps as well. And so the Iranians aren't going to go all in if they think they can get a better deal or have a more conducive atmosphere in the near future. If the Iranians believe, for example, that a Harris administration is going to increase the pressure on Israel, starve Israel militarily, and basically, even though Harris would deny this, do Iran's dirty work for them, the Iranians aren't not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. So you have that aspect as well. And then the Iranians are also, just like the Russians of old, going to fall back on their strategic depth. Iran is 4 times the size of Iraq. It's 6 times the size of the United Kingdom. And the Iranians may believe that they can absorb an Israeli hit more than Israel can absorb one of their hits. Now, a lot of people in Israel, but more so in the United States, would applaud Israel's defense over the massive airstrike a few months ago when Iran launched 300 missiles, drones, and so forth at Israel. And only about 7 missiles got through. And Israel can say, as well as the United States, that that is an indication of Israel's air defense. But is it really? What if those 7 missiles had chemical, biological, or nuclear warheads? This is where the deterrence really is breaking down.
Well, speaking of Iran and deals, I'm fascinated by how amid this, Middle East conflict right now, that it's somewhat under the radar where Iran is with respect to its nuclear program. Secretary of State Blinken just said recently that nuclear breakout time is now just 1 to 2 weeks. I know this is something you've been tracking for a better part of a decade now. How do you think we ended up here? I mean, we've gone from the Obama JCPOA push to Donald Trump and, the sanctions regime that he put in place. Now Biden trying to resurrect the JCPOA early in his term. So we've had all kinds of different U.S. approaches to Iran, but somehow we're back at a point where their breakout time could be as little as 1 week. How did we get here and where are we going with this?
Ben, first of all, there's always an arrogance to American policy where we engage in wishful thinking and begin to calibrate our policies to that wishful thinking rather than the reality of the situation. So we've had successive administrations that put their neck out diplomatically and haven't wanted to admit the failures of their policies. And therefore, that actually politicizes intelligence more than any recent event. I mean, the Bush administration, of course, is often accused of politicizing intelligence. Several years ago, actually about a decade ago, I had done an academic article for the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, which found basically that when it comes to politicization of intelligence, much more often it's done in favor of diplomatic processes in order to keep them alive than in contrast to provide an excuse for belligerence. So you have that issue. The other issue, however, and this is where I disagree with everyone, I mean, just being one of these think tank analysts who will a pox on everyone's house, is that when we talk about Iran's nuclear program and its breakout time, the way successive administrations have defined this is Iran being able to produce 20 kilograms of highly enriched weapons-grade uranium or plutonium and launching it in a fissile bomb delivered on a warhead. Why do we assume that Iran's going to want the perfect solution? Already, when we talk about 90% enriched uranium, what was the enrichment level when we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki? It was in the high 70s or low 80s in terms of those bombs. And why do we assume that Iran is going to want a perfect nuclear weapon? What happens if they can explode a dirty bomb, which they already can?
Do you think they're closer than that 1 to 2 weeks, you think?
I think potentially they are closer than that, simply because they can go ahead and launch in a way that might not be even up to Hiroshima and Nagasaki standards, but can still do a huge degree of damage. If you simply have a dirty bomb go off in Tel Aviv, what's that going to do for the future of Tel Aviv?
Lastly, on Iran, I'm fascinated by this question of what a policy would look like if somebody came to you and said, "Oh, I want to dismantle the axis of resistance, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, the militias that have targeted U.S. troops. We want to get rid of it, dismantle it, eliminate it as a threat to the U.S., to Israel, to our interests." Is there a way to do that without just flat out regime change in Tehran?
Yes, I do. Look, when it comes to the so-called axis of resistance, there's two components to this. There's the head of the octopus and the tentacles of the octopus. The strategy needs to address both. So the first thing is you starve the supply. A little while ago, I wrote with regard to the Houthis, and Ben, I used to live in Yemen, that there's three ways the Houthis get their weaponry. Number one is through the port of Hodeidah. So why aren't we blockading the port of Hodeidah? Number two is through Oman overland. And number three is by air. And Yemeni Air is flying now, sometimes to Beirut, even though in theory it's only supposed to be flying to Jordan. So what are we doing to close the Sana'a airport? What are we doing to close the Hodeidah port? And what are we doing to tell the Sultanate of Oman enough already? That's number one. And similar issues with regard to Hezbollah, with regard to blocking the land bridge. Rather than rolling up our forces in Iraq and northeastern Syria, perhaps we should be augmenting them. So that's another example. When it comes to Iran itself, here's what I would do. Simply bombing Iran is only going to kick the can down the road, and it doesn't substitute for having an actual policy in place. When it comes to Iran itself, let's look at this analytically. There can be no effective change in Iran, politically or in terms of military policy, until we address the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, until we fracture it. Too often we talk about what we know in intelligence, but we don't talk about what we don't know. So we talk about hardliners and reformers in Iran, but we don't talk about the factional divisions within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. How can we exploit those factions? There's two strategies. Number one, I think Mike Pompeo was onto something when it came to maximum pressure. Back a few years ago, during the height of the maximum pressure campaign, I went to Nabatea it's basically like Hezbollah Central in southern Lebanon. And I was talking to defectors from Hezbollah who said they joined it for the cash, but they were no longer getting paid in dollars. They were getting paid in Lebanese pounds, which is like getting paid in dirty toilet paper. And they could no longer have access to the Hezbollah subsidized stores because the goods were running out. And Hezbollah people were, basically going home left, right, and center. So you only had to deal with the 10% of the ideologues instead of an exponentially larger group. So what are we doing? It's the utmost arrogance, Ben, to say that an American strategy towards Iran has to be confined to the American political calendar. And this is where I lament that the Reagan administration days of Reagan and Tip O'Neill are over, and everything's become a national security football. But then I think we can be creative in fracturing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Here's what I would do. When I used to teach for the U.S. Navy as a civilian, I learned a lot about the Navy, and I saw all our hospital ships, the USNS Comfort or the USNS Mercy. Why don't we send a hospital ship over to Dubai and tell the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps veterans who suffer worse veteran services, medical services, than we do when we complain about the VA? Why don't we publicly announce that we're willing to give Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps veterans free medical care in Dubai? If they accept it, that's a huge propaganda coup, and it's a huge intelligence coup. If they refuse and they're not allowed to travel for that, think of the dissension that's going to cause within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps circles.
I was going to say, you're talking about some creative, foreign policy approaches to some of these issues. And unfortunately, we've seen a pretty unimaginative Biden administration on a lot of these fronts. So what their willingness is to do something like that, I'm not sure. Speaking of the Biden administration, turn back to Israel for a second. Do you think there's been lasting damage done with the way that the administration has, its rhetoric and in some cases its policies, withholding weapons on a couple of occasions to Israel for its war against Hamas? Does this do permanent damage, or does this kind of blow over if there's a change in administrations or we get some kind of ceasefire deal?
It does do lasting damage because it gives sustenance to all those who want to eradicate the state of Israel, to believe that even if we have a much more responsible administration in power for the next 4 years, all they need to do is outlast that administration, because the core of the debate within the Democratic Party is all about isolationism, surrender, and throwing allies under the bus. So instead of actually enabling peace, what we're doing is encouraging the hardliners overseas to avoid compromise and to continue to believe that a military solution, if they have enough patience, will be able to be victorious, that they will believe that they can outlast Israel.
Last thing, Michael, before we wrap up here, we're now 3 years since the U.S. completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021. And you don't need to look very hard to find some pretty worrying signs, whether it's UN reports talking about Al-Qaeda training camps all over the country now. And of course, we know the growing threat from ISIS-K. I just can't help but wonder, and none of us can predict the future here, Michael, but when historians look back on this 5-10 years from now or longer down the road, do you think history is going to determine that the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan, the way that it was done, ended up being a pretty major mistake?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have a bad habit of claiming victory in the short term at the expense of a much more dangerous and deadly long term. Again, Afghanistan is a case in point where we put wishful thinking above reality. And the fact of the matter is, the Taliban are now much more dangerous than they were pre 9/11, simply because they're much better resourced. And that wishful thinking continues. For example, just a few weeks ago, the Biden administration acquiesced to give the Taliban control over their airspace. And so now we have a situation where the Chinese are working with the Taliban at the Bagram Air Base in order to undermine our drone operations. And yet, when the Biden administration pulled out 3 years ago, Jake Sullivan promised that, we could conduct counterterrorism over the horizon. We could use those drones. And now, through our own incompetence, we're even rolling that up. So, I think historians are going to be perplexed at how we engaged in such an orgy of stupidity that endangered so many lives and endangered our strategic position.
Yeah. One over-the-horizon strike over the past 3 years.
Absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely bizarre.
We were promised that was going to be the miracle cure to whatever terrorist threats would pop up in Afghanistan after we left, was these over-the-horizon strikes. There's been one in the past 3 years. It's amazing. It's amazing. Michael Rubin, thank you so much for joining us here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here on the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether here at home or somewhere around the world, that is impacting U.S. national security right now this week as you all are listening to the show. Guy, what do you have for us for your Threat of the Week?
My Threat of the Week, Ben, has to do with what's come to be referred to in U.S. national security circles as the battle for global data dominance. My threat specifically is that the U.S. government, and to some extent U.S. private companies and citizens, are at risk of losing control of this battle to other non-democratic, non-free market forces in the world, with China the most likely adversarial leader in this case. This has to do with advanced electronics technology, anything that has microchips in it that soak up user data. It could be your refrigerator, your TV, your laptop, how you do your banking. It could be in the future your electric car. For context here, Ben, remember the Biden administration announced that it was launching an investigation into Chinese-made smart cars that gather sensitive information about Americans driving those cars. This was back in February of this year. The administration cited potential national security risks, and that investigation is ongoing. It's playing out in the backdrop of this very real but also very theoretical great power battle over who in the future will control such data. Maybe this all sounds like pie-in-the-sky madness, but if we think about how technology and human use of it is evolving very quickly, we have to ask ourselves what governments or people or corporations will control that future landscape of data, say 60 years from now. And my threat of the week is that there's a real risk. It may not be the United States or a group of U.S. aligned companies or countries.
Yeah, that's certainly a threat that's only going to grow more prominent, I think, as time goes on here. Guy, my threat of the week is Afghanistan. We're now 3 years this month since the U.S. military left Afghanistan, ending 20 years of war, the longest war in U.S. history. It feels like a lifetime ago, but it's worth remembering that we invaded Afghanistan to topple the Taliban, which had given al-Qaeda safe haven there, to plot the September 11th, 2001 attacks. The Taliban's, of course, now back in charge of Afghanistan. In some ways, it's starting to feel like we may have stepped into a dangerous time machine here. Friend of the show, Bill Roggio of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, recently had a really great analysis of al-Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan. He said that according to UN data and other information, al-Qaeda now operates training camps in 12 Afghan provinces. And then a recent UN report that Bill cited in his analysis from just last month found that al-Qaeda, quote, remains strategically patient, cooperating with other terrorist groups in Afghanistan and prioritizing its ongoing relationship with the Taliban, unquote. It also went on to say that al-Qaeda figures in Afghanistan are working at sort of the grassroots level. They're engaging with warlords, propagandists, recruiters, financiers. And essentially, they're rebuilding the kind of infrastructure, the sort of quasi-government infrastructure, the al-Qaeda-Taliban relationship, eerily similar to what we saw in the years leading up to 9/11. And we also, of course, have the threat from ISIS-K, the Islamic State's Afghan affiliate, which clearly has the ability to conduct external attacks, as we saw in Iran, Russia, and elsewhere just this year. So, look, at the end of the day here, Guy, this is a threat because we're seeing a pretty deadly cocktail sort of get shaken up and stirred right before our eyes. Al-Qaeda training camps, terrorists burrowing themselves into the economic and social fabric of the country. And by the way, the U.S. is essentially absent from the scene there. We have limited at best ability to carry out any kind of these, quote, over the horizon strikes that we were promised we'd be able to see, even if we wanted to. And it's not really clear we actually want to anyway at this point. So all of this makes Afghanistan an increasingly dangerous situation. And that's why it's my threat of the week. So thank you all so much for joining us this week. Thank you, Guy, as always. Big thanks to Michael Rubin for coming on and covering threats from all around the world for us here this week. So please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and we will be back next week here on the Threat Status Podcast.